Before dawn had fully broken over London, a sound unlike any the city had heard in years began to rise through the fog, steady, unified, unmistakable. Londoners stepped from shattered doorways and war-torn streets, drawn toward the echo of marching boots. And as the first American troops emerged through Whitehall, something extraordinary happened. The battered heart of a nation began to beat with new strength. Winston Churchill, watching from the edge of the street, understood instantly what the moment meant. This was not just a parade. It was the arrival of a force that could change the fate of the world. London, early 1942. The city was awake long before the winter sun broke through the low, heavy clouds. For more than 2 years, the British capital had lived under the constant shadow of war, its skyline carved by smoke, its nights shredded by sirens, and its people hardened by loss. Streets, once bustling with business, were now flanked by sandbags, barbed wire, and the ghostly silhouettes of buildings half collapsed by German bombs. The Blitz had ended, but its scars remained. Broken chimneys, hollow roofs, and families who would never again sit together for supper. Yet that morning, something in the air felt different. It was not hope exactly, but a shift, subtle, quiet, and building beneath the rhythmic pulse of the city. The fog that lay low over Westminster carried a sound Londoners were not accustomed to hearing, the cadence of synchronized boots, steady and deliberate. At first, it blended with the usual rumble of lorries and the distant whistle of trains, but soon the sound grew louder, clearer, and unmistakable. American troops were marching through London for the first time. Inside the underground war rooms a few blocks away, Winston Churchill had been reviewing overnight telegrams when an aide approached him. "Prime Minister, the Americans have begun their march through Whitehall." Churchill paused. He already knew they had arrived. Ships from across the Atlantic had been unloading soldiers, vehicles, crates, and supplies for weeks. But hearing that they were marching, visibly, publicly, through the streets he vowed to defend, that was different. It meant the partnership was no longer an agreement on paper. It was living, breathing, stepping across London stone. He rose from his chair, adjusted his waistcoat, and reached for his Homburg hat. His cigar glowed faintly in the dim light as he made his way through the corridors, past maps marked with pins, past secretaries scribbling, past officers coordinating the next convoys. Churchill understood better than anyone the symbolic weight of the moment. For the first time since the war began, the British Empire was no longer standing alone. Outside, the cold air greeted him with a bite, carrying the distant rumble of marching columns. As he stepped into the open, the street was already lined with civilians. Men in overcoats, women wrapped in scarves, children perched on ledges, faces still tired from years of war, but illuminated with cautious curiosity. Then the Americans appeared. They came in formation, uniforms crisp despite their journey across the Atlantic. Their helmets, polished and rounded, reflected the muted London daylight. Their boots struck the pavement with precision. Their rifles rested on strong shoulders, many belonging to young men who had never been further from home than the next county back in the States. For Londoners, it was a sight both foreign and familiar. Foreign because these soldiers looked different, taller on average, broader in build, carrying an air of confidence that came from a nation not yet touched by the devastation Europe had endured. Familiar because at that moment they were not just guests or allies. They were reinforcements. They were proof that the tide could indeed turn. The crowd softened, first in whispers, then in applause. A woman wiping soot off her coat raised her handkerchief in greeting. A group of dock workers cheered. Children waved as though greeting heroes from a storybook. The Americans responded with disciplined stillness, but a few allowed themselves small smiles, nods, and glances toward the man waiting along the railing. Churchill stood near the stone balustrade opposite the Ministry of Defense, leaning lightly on his cane. His presence was unmistakable. Bulldog posture, heavy coat, hat lowered slightly against the wind. Cigarette smoke curled up beside him, dissolving into the winter air. Officers around him stiffened, but Churchill's face softened as he watched the line of American infantry approach. The Prime Minister did not speak immediately. He simply removed his hat in a slow, deliberate salute. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of millions who had endured, suffered, resisted, and waited for this day. The Americans responded by turning their eyes toward him, a silent acknowledgement exchanged between the leader of a battered nation and the soldiers arriving to join its fight. Churchill knew what this moment meant. Britain had survived its darkest night, but it could not win the war alone. Now, marching before him on the streets of London was the greatest industrial power in the world, stepping into the conflict with unmistakable resolve. The sound of boots echoed down Whitehall long after the first column had passed. Churchill watched until the final ranks disappeared around the bend, leaving behind a city strangely quiet. But it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence that follows a deep breath, taken after years of holding it in. For the first time in a long while, London felt the future shift. The Americans continued their advance down Whitehall, the rhythmic thump of their boots echoing off the stone facades like a heartbeat pulsing through the city. Their lines were immaculately straight, helmets aligned, rifles angled perfectly, steps landing in unison as if the whole formation breathed together. London had seen many troops pass through its avenues since the war began, but nothing quite like this. These soldiers came from across an ocean, from towns and farmlands and industrial cities, untouched by the nightly terror Britons had endured. Their uniforms were clean, their equipment new, their youth unmistakable. To the war-weary crowds, they looked almost unreal, like an army summoned from a different world. As they moved forward, more Londoners filled the sidewalks. Some emerged from nearby offices, others from pubs or shops. Many simply followed the sound of marching, drawn to it as if compelled by instinct. A milkman wiped his hands on his apron, folded his arms, and watched silently. An elderly man removed his cap, holding it against his chest with trembling fingers. A group of young women, factory workers from the East End, stood together, whispering before one of them finally said aloud, "They look like they've already won." But behind the crisp appearance of the US soldiers was a deeper story. They had trained tirelessly for months in camps across America, preparing for a war that had suddenly become real after Pearl Harbor. For many, stepping onto London streets was their first direct encounter with what the conflict truly meant. They had heard about the Blitz, seen photographs of ruined neighborhoods in newspapers, but nothing compared to witnessing it firsthand. As they marched, their eyes occasionally drifted to charred window frames, piles of rubble, and empty lots where buildings once stood. It was a sobering sight. One soldier, Private Frank Donnelly of the 29th Infantry Division, stole a quick glance upward at a bombed-out roof. He nudged the man beside him and whispered from the corner of his mouth, "My God, people lived through this." His fellow soldier gave a slight nod but kept his jaw tight, understanding the weight of what they were stepping into. Meanwhile, Churchill remained near the railing, observing every detail. He recognized the significance of public morale, how fragile it could be, how desperately it needed fuel, and he could see clearly what the presence of the Americans was doing. Londoners who had grown accustomed to grief were now experiencing something else entirely: reassurance, a visible sign that Britain was no longer fighting in isolation. The alliance, once a diplomatic arrangement and a series of coordinated strategies, now marched before their eyes. As the columns continued to advance, a small boy pushed through the crowd. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, his coat oversized and patched at the elbows. He raised a tiny hand toward the passing line of soldiers, unsure if anyone would notice. Then a young American at the edge of the formation, his face barely more than a teenager's, broke military stiffness just enough to wink at the boy. The child's face lit up as though someone had turned on a lamp inside him. From a balcony overhead, a woman leaned forward and called out, "Welcome, boys! Give Hitler what for!" Her voice cracked, but her spirit didn't. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Even Churchill allowed himself a faint smile, but not everyone's emotions were light. Some Londoners watched with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. They had endured 2 years of destruction without knowing whether help would come in time. The arrival of these young Americans brought hope, but also reminded them of how dire things had become. The Royal Navy was overstretched, the RAF exhausted, and the British Army strained on every front. If the Americans had delayed even a little longer, the outcome might have been very different. Further down the street, a BBC correspondent recorded the scene in his small notepad. He scribbled rapidly, capturing the reactions around him. Later, in a radio broadcast, he would describe the moment as a turning of the tide made visible to the common eye. His words would be heard across the nation that evening, offering comfort to those who had not been able to witness the march themselves. As the troops passed the cenotaph, the solemn monument honoring Britain's war dead, the formation subtly shifted. The soldiers straightened even more, steps sharpening with reverence. A British officer near the monument stood to attention, saluting crisply as the Americans marched by. For a brief moment, all noise seemed to soften as both nations honored the sacrifices already made and the ones yet to come. Churchill took a long breath, his chest rising under his heavy coat. He understood the immense symbolism of what he was witnessing. This was not simply military pageantry, it was the physical embodiment of a global alliance. The United Kingdom, battered but unbroken, was welcoming the industrial might of the United States into the heart of its capital. The war had entered a new chapter, and Churchill could feel the shift as clearly as the cold winter wind brushing past him. When the final ranks disappeared into the distance, the noise of boots faded, replaced by applause that lingered like the last echo of a church bell. For the people of London, the march was over. But for the war, it was only the beginning of a partnership that would help determine the fate of the world. When the final ranks of American troops disappeared down Whitehall, the crowds gradually began to disperse. Some lingered, reluctant to let the moment end. Others returned to their routines with a renewed sense of energy that had been absent for months. Yet the most significant reaction of the day did not come from the public. It came from Winston Churchill himself, once he stepped away from the railing and into the quieter interior corridors of the government buildings. Churchill walked slowly at first, cane tapping lightly against the stone floor, his mind returning to the parade he had just witnessed. He had always been a man of strong conviction and sharp foresight, but he was also capable of deep emotion. Those who encountered him in passing often saw the bulldog exterior, the firm jaw, the cigar, the gruff humor, but few recognized how profoundly he felt the weight of responsibility. Seeing American troops on British soil had stirred something in him that words could not fully contain. Near the entrance of the Ministry of Defense, an aide approached with a stack of papers. "Prime Minister, the Joint Planning Committee is requesting—" Churchill raised a hand gently, signaling the aide to pause. "Give me a moment," he said softly, almost whispering. The aide stepped back, surprised by the Prime Minister's tone. Churchill moved to a nearby window overlooking the street where the march had taken place. The echoes of boots had faded, replaced by the distant hum of London traffic. Across the way, he could still see Londoners embracing the significance of the morning. A pair of elderly women were speaking animatedly, pointing in the direction the Americans had gone. A group of young boys reenacted the marching steps, exaggerated but earnest, and several soldiers of the Home Guard leaned on their rifles, still watching with quiet admiration. Inside Churchill's mind, however, the scene carried a heavier layer of meaning. For 2 years, Britain had stood alone, battered but defiant. The country had endured relentless bombing, food shortages, and uncertainty. Many nights Churchill had wondered privately whether the nation could hold long enough for help to come. He never shared such doubts publicly. He believed steadfast leadership was essential to national survival. But the fear had been real. And now, these American troops were proof that Britain had not held out in vain. He replayed the image of their precise formation, young faces determined, posture firm, uniforms bright. They looked like an army ready not just to fight, but to reshape the course of the war. Their presence felt like the first gust of wind before a long-awaited storm, the kind capable of sweeping across continents. A senior military advisor, General Hastings Ismay, approached Churchill quietly. "A remarkable sight, sir," Ismay said. Churchill nodded, still gazing out the window. "Indeed, a sight that will be remembered," he replied. Ismay paused before adding, "The Americans are eager, but many have never faced combat." That prompted Churchill to turn fully toward him. "Neither had many of our boys in 1940, yet they stood firm when the world seemed ready to collapse." Ismay gave a small nod of respect. He knew Churchill was right. Wars were not only won by experience, but by resolve, industry, and unity, all of which the United States possessed in abundance. For a moment, Churchill's thoughts drifted to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Their relationship had evolved into something rare between world leaders, genuine friendship built on shared purpose and mutual trust. The American president had once referred to Britain as the spearhead of resistance. Now, the rest of the spear, the force behind the blow, had arrived. Churchill allowed himself a small smile at the thought. He turned back toward the room. "Have the cabinet convene at 4 this afternoon," he instructed Ismay. "We have an alliance to strengthen." But the weight of his private emotions remained. He walked deeper into the corridor, past maps of Europe pinned with red flags representing enemy-held territory. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of one map. France occupied, the Low Countries lost, Eastern Europe crushed. So much had been destroyed. Yet for the first time, Churchill felt a shift in the balance, a possibility that the axis of the war might tilt in the Allies' favor. He made his way to his office and sat at the large wooden desk. Papers lay scattered in organized chaos, briefing notes mixed with telegrams, reports, and directives. Churchill picked up his fountain pen, but did not write immediately. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had seen. The Americans had come, not as tentative observers or cautious partners, but as soldiers marching confidently on British streets. Their presence was a promise. Britain would not fight alone anymore. After several moments of silence, Churchill finally spoke aloud to the empty room, his voice low but filled with conviction. "This changes everything." The words hung in the air, carried by the quiet resolve that had defined him throughout the war. He then leaned forward, set his cigar aside, and began drafting a note to the War Cabinet, a reflection on the symbolic importance of the day and a call for renewed coordination with the United States. Every line carried the same underlying message: the tide could now be turned. Outside, the grey sky began to brighten slightly, as if London itself sensed the shift that Churchill felt so deeply. The city was still wounded, still weary, but it was no longer alone. And the Prime Minister, who had carried the burden of that isolation for so long, finally felt the pressure begin to lift. In the days that followed the American march through London, the city carried a different atmosphere, subtle yet unmistakable. Newsreels replayed the footage across cinemas, radio commentators described the event with rising optimism, and newspapers printed photographs of the young Americans whose presence had electrified the capital. For a nation battered by 2 relentless years of war, the arrival of the United States was more than reinforcement. It was a psychological turning point. Londoners walked with heads a bit higher, their conversations a touch lighter, as though the city itself had exhaled for the first time in months. Inside Whitehall, the tone had shifted as well. Meetings that once felt heavy with uncertainty now carried renewed strategic ambition. The War Cabinet moved with increased determination, discussing possibilities that only weeks earlier had seemed premature. American generals and British commanders walked the same hallways, exchanged the same maps, and debated the same problems. Collaboration, once theoretical, now unfolded in real time. On a crisp morning shortly after the march, Churchill entered the cabinet room with a folder tucked under his arm. The room fell silent as he approached the head of the long table. Ministers, officers, and advisors watched him expectantly. They could sense that he brought more than paperwork. He carried momentum. Churchill placed the folder down, adjusted his glasses, and began speaking without ceremony. "Gentlemen," he said, "we stand at the threshold of a new chapter in this war. The arrival of our American friends is not merely symbolic, it is decisive." His voice, though measured, carried a force that gripped the room. He outlined the latest intelligence, increased American shipments of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition, the expansion of air bases across England to receive US bombers, and the steady influx of soldiers who would soon join operations in North Africa and Western Europe. Every fact reinforced his point. The alliance was no longer a series of promises, it was action. Churchill tapped a finger on the map of the Atlantic. "Hitler once believed he could starve us into submission by severing these waters," he said. "Now the Americans will help sweep them clean." Across the table, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden nodded. "The U-boats cannot match combined production," he added. "American shipyards are launching vessels faster than the Germans can sink them." At the far end of the room, a US military liaison, Colonel David Ross, listened intently. He had witnessed the march firsthand and understood what it meant to the British people. When Churchill signaled to him, Ross stepped forward. "Prime Minister, gentlemen," he began, "our President considers this alliance not merely a necessity, but a moral obligation. We will not allow tyranny to prevail in Europe. You have stood firm for 2 years. Now, we stand with you." Churchill gave a firm nod. "Well said, Colonel." The discussion turned to joint strategy, the increasing pressure in North Africa, the critical need to keep supply convoys alive, the potential for future operations on the European mainland. No one in the room believed victory was near, but for the first time since 1940, they believed victory was possible. Outside the cabinet room, the partnership took on more visible form. American officers visited RAF bases, exchanging knowledge on aircraft capabilities. British engineers inspected US Sherman tanks, comparing them with their own armor. In mess halls across southern England, British and American soldiers sat side by side, sharing meals, jokes, and stories about home. Cultural gaps produced occasional friction. Americans found British tea too weak, while Britons found American chewing gum a strange habit, but camaraderie developed quickly. Both sides recognized that their futures now depended on each other. Meanwhile, the public continued to absorb the new reality. On buses, shop queues, and crowded train platforms, conversations often drifted to the Americans. Mothers spoke about the young soldiers who reminded them of their own sons. Older men recalled World War I and expressed relief that the United States had arrived early enough this time. Even the press shifted tone. Rather than speculating on Britain's chances of survival, headlines now spoke of an awakening giant joining the struggle. Churchill, however, understood the danger of complacency. The war was still raging on every front, and the bloodiest years were yet to come. But he also recognized the power of morale, how it fueled resilience, shaped perception, and steered nations through crisis. So when he addressed Parliament days later, He chose his words carefully. Standing before the Commons, he declared, "The march of American troops through our capital is more than a show of solidarity. It is a proclamation that the free nations of the world will not yield. Shoulder to shoulder, we shall advance until the final victory is won." The chamber erupted in applause, not merely out of patriotism, but out of belief. Later that evening, Churchill returned to the war rooms. He descended the narrow staircase, past telephone operators and clerks sorting messages, until he reached the map room. Dozens of colorful pins marked the shifting positions of Allied and Axis forces. He studied the Atlantic map closely, noting the increased Allied shipping routes. American supply convoys were already altering patterns that had once seemed dangerously thin. He placed his hands behind his back, exhaled deeply, and spoke quietly to an aide nearby. The march was only the beginning. Now the real work begins. Outside, London's lights remained dimmed under blackout restrictions, but beneath the darkness, there was a spark of confidence not seen since the war began. The city understood, as did Churchill, that a turning point had arrived. The United States had stepped onto the stage, and with it, the war's destiny was beginning to shift. As weeks turned into months, the significance of that first American march through London continued to ripple through the British war effort. What began as a symbolic parade steadily transformed into a full-scale partnership, one that would redefine the trajectory of the conflict. Londoners, who had once walked through ruined streets with quiet endurance, now carried themselves with a renewed sense of purpose. The city remained scarred, its nights still bound by blackout curtains. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The belief that victory, once distant, now glimmered on the horizon. Across the British Isles, evidence of American presence multiplied rapidly. New airfields stretched across formerly quiet countryside. Convoys of US trucks traversed muddy rural roads, delivering supplies to bases and ports. Railway stations echoed with American accents as troops moved between training grounds. In coastal towns, locals grew accustomed to seeing young men from places like Kansas, New York, Texas, and California strolling near docks or writing letters home in chilly cafes. These soldiers brought with them an energy that Britain had not seen in years. They spoke with confidence, laughed loudly, and carried themselves with the conviction of a nation that had never been invaded, never bombed nightly, never forced to ration every crumb. Their spirit did not erase Britain's hardships, but it supplemented them, strengthened them like fresh timber reinforcing an old beam. Inside the war rooms, Churchill watched these changes with growing determination. His staff noticed a shift in him as well. He moved through briefings with greater urgency, issued directives with sharper clarity, and pressed the military leadership to take full advantage of the newfound Allied unity. One evening, he convened a strategic meeting with British chiefs of staff and several senior American officers. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and damp wool coats as maps were unrolled across the conference table. Thick black pencils drew lines across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Western Europe, while planners debated the sequence of operations. General George Marshall's representatives argued that Europe must eventually be invaded directly to break the Axis grip. British commanders, scarred by the memory of Dunkirk and the costly failures of earlier campaigns, advocated for a methodical approach. Weaken Germany through North Africa, attack its underbelly in Italy, then strike the Western Front when conditions were ripe. Churchill listened, interjecting occasionally with pointed questions or historical analogies. He understood the complexity of coordinating two massive military structures with different strategies and cultures. Yet beneath the disagreements lay a profound truth. Both nations were now bound to a common goal. The debate was not whether to defeat Hitler, but how. After hours of discussion, Churchill stood and placed both hands on the table. "Gentlemen," he said, "let us not forget what brought us here. The shared resolve to end tyranny. The world is watching. History will judge us not by the route we take, but by our unity in the journey." The room fell silent. Then slowly, one by one, the officers nodded. They resumed the meeting with renewed focus. Outside the war rooms, the Allied partnership became increasingly visible. British and American pilots flew joint missions. Engineers collaborated on equipment improvements. Intelligence officers exchanged vital information. Even in everyday interactions, small gestures reinforced the growing bond. American soldiers sharing coffee or chocolate with British children, British families inviting US troops into their homes for Sunday dinner, and soldiers from both nations joining in raucous dances at village halls. Yet the war remained far from over. Reports from the Eastern Front described devastating battles between Germany and the Soviet Union. In the Far East, Japan pressed aggressively toward India and the Pacific Islands. The global situation remained perilous, and Churchill knew that the hardest decisions still lay ahead. But he also understood that the world looked different now. Britain was no longer standing alone in a storm. The United States, an industrial titan capable of producing more planes, ships and tanks than any other nation, had fully committed to the conflict. Their resources, manpower and determination were beginning to tip the balance. Late one night, Churchill returned to his office after a long day of briefings. He sank into his chair, lit a cigar, and stared at a framed map of Europe on the wall. The pins marking enemy positions still dominated the board, but he could sense a shift, not in the map, but in time itself. The war was no longer a defensive struggle for survival. It was becoming a coordinated push toward eventual victory. He leaned back, exhaling a slow ribbon of smoke. In the quiet of that small room beneath the streets of Westminster, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the march, the crisp American uniforms, the steady cadence of boots, the faces of Londoners watching with hope. That moment had been the turning point, a spark that illuminated a path through the darkness. And now, through cooperation, sacrifice, and unyielding resolve, that spark was growing. Churchill whispered softly to himself, "This is how the tide turns."